Something most people never question is the simplest one. Why was the Bible written at all? Not what it says, not whether it's true, but why it exists. Because here's the unsettling part. The Bible didn't appear as a message from the sky. It was assembled, rewritten, edited, filtered, approved, and enforced by human hands with human motives. And once you see the motives, the book stops looking divine. It starts looking strategic. Today, we're going to trace the hidden intention behind the Bible, not the stories, not the miracles, but the real driving force that shaped it. And once you understand that, you'll never read it the same way again. It didn't start with faith, it started with fear. Think about ancient people for a moment. Imagine living in a world where every night felt dangerous and every sunrise felt uncertain. The sky flashed and cracked without warning. Plagues swept through villages with no explanation. Crops failed, rivers dried. Raids happened without mercy. Children died before anyone could understand why. When you live inside that kind of constant uncertainty, you are not searching for spiritual enlightenment. You are searching for stability, for something that gives shape to the chaos. Fear is not just an emotion in that environment. Fear becomes the air people breathe. It becomes the silent law everyone follows. And fear, when strong enough, pushes people to create meaning even where none exists. It pushes them to invent explanations, patterns, stories, anything that promises a sense of control. So, the earliest biblical stories were not written to reveal a cosmic truth. They were written to create a psychological shield. If a storm destroys your home, the story can say it happened for a reason. If lightning strikes your field, the story can say someone angered a powerful being. Suddenly, the fear is not random anymore. It has rules, it has logic, and if it has logic, maybe you can survive it. If we tell a story that explains the storm, maybe people will not panic. That is the mindset behind the first sacred narratives. If we give people rituals to follow, if we give them consequences to fear, maybe they will behave. Maybe the village will hold together. Stories became tools. Rules became insurance against chaos. Belief became a form of social protection. The Bible did not begin as a spiritual masterpiece. It began as a survival strategy created by people desperate for order. And here is where everything becomes more revealing. Someone had to hold the pen. Who controls the story, controls the people. In every ancient culture, the storyteller was never just a storyteller. The person who shaped the narrative shaped the world around them. Priests, scribes, elders, anyone who could interpret signs or speak with authority about the unseen became the quiet power behind every tribe. They did not need armies, they did not need wealth, they only needed belief. Because if you can convince people that your words carry the voice of a higher power, you gain something no king has ever truly held. You gain obedience without force. A king can punish your body, but his reach ends there. A divine figure, especially one defined by fear, can punish your soul. That difference changes everything. One demands compliance, the other demands surrender. Once early leaders understood this, the sacred stories started to shift. They stopped being simple explanations for storms or sickness. They became tools for influence. A story that once calmed fear started to justify authority. A rule that once kept a village organized started to protect the people who issued the rules. The sacred text slowly transformed from a cultural tradition into a political instrument. And here is the part most people never notice. The stories were not consistent. In fact, they often contradicted one another. Some texts portrayed a forgiving creator, others demanded blood. Some praised mercy, others commanded annihilation. If this were divine truth carved in stone, it would look cleaner, sharper, more unified, but it does not. It looks like something written by many hands, each with its own agenda. The contradictions are not flaws, they are fingerprints. They reveal competing interests, rival factions, shifting power structures. The stories did not need to agree. They only needed to maintain influence. And that influence grew as long as people kept listening. Contradictions aren't mistakes, they're red flags. Most people notice the contradictions in the Bible, but they usually shrug them off as copying mistakes or translation problems. They assume the scribes slipped, or a word was lost over time, or a detail simply changed as the story spread. But what if the inconsistencies are not accidents at all? What if they are signals pointing to something deeper? Not divine confusion, but human interference. If the Bible were the work of a single mind, the voice would feel unified, the tone would feel consistent, the values would follow a straight line. But instead, you find sudden shifts in personality. One chapter shows a God filled with mercy, another shows a God demanding slaughter. One passage praises compassion, another orders strict punishment for even the smallest mistake. These are not the signs of one storyteller, they are the signs of many. Think of these contradictions as clues that the book was shaped by different tribes, different eras, different power groups, all trying to claim the same divine authority for themselves. Some wanted a warrior god who justified conquest. Others wanted a gentle shepherd who offered hope. Some wanted strict law to control behavior. Others wanted ritual purity to control identity. And some, perhaps the most powerful, wanted a god whose rules conveniently protected their own status. When you read these sections back to back, you can almost feel the negotiation happening. It starts to look less like a holy vision and more like a council room filled with leaders pushing their preferred story. Each group edits a little. Each group adds their voice. Each group reshapes the character of the divine into something that supports their needs. And then comes the shift that changes everything. Because once you recognize the contradictions, you begin to see the strategy behind them. The Bible wasn't preserved because it was holy. It was holy because it was preserved. Imagine the ancient world before there was a single book called the Bible. Imagine scrolls scattered across regions, stories traded between tribes, myths carried by merchants, poems sung around fires, laws recorded on clay tablets, dozens of texts, hundreds of versions, countless voices, a swirling sea of beliefs and traditions, none of them fixed, none of them final. Some of those texts disappeared simply because the tribe that told them vanished. Others were pushed aside because they did not serve the leaders who rose to power. Some were banned outright because they challenged the authority of the priestly class. Others were destroyed during wars or rewritten so heavily that the original message became unrecognizable. So the question is not why these sacred texts survived. The real question is why these particular ones were chosen to survive. And the answer has nothing to do with divine selection. They survived because they were useful to priests who needed rules to legitimize their position, useful to rulers who needed stories that kept people loyal, useful to growing empires that needed a single identity to bind diverse tribes together. A text that supports authority is far more likely to be copied and preserved than a text that questions it. Holiness was not the cause of preservation. Holiness was the label placed on the text that proved politically convenient. Once a book is called holy, it gains automatic power. Once it gains power, it becomes dangerous to question. And once questioning becomes dangerous, the book becomes a tool of control. The label of sacred did not protect the text because of its truth. It protected the text because of its usefulness, and usefulness always attracts something darker. Rewrite something enough times, it stops belonging to the truth. The Bible was not simply written once and then carried untouched through history. It lived through the hands of countless editors, translators, and political leaders who all believed they had the right to adjust its meaning. Empires rose and collapsed. Civilizations shifted. New languages replaced older ones. Cultural values changed dramatically, and with every change came a new wave of revisions. Every time the world shifted, someone reached for the text and reshaped it to fit the moment. A line was added to support a new idea. A story was trimmed because it no longer matched the political winds. A command was strengthened to reinforce authority. A threat was softened because it made the God of the text look too cruel for the era. You can almost feel the presence of these unseen editors, bending the narrative toward whatever served their purpose. These changes were not gentle acts of spiritual preservation. They were deliberate acts of narrative management. When a kingdom needed unity, the text was shaped to promote unity. When a ruler needed obedience, the text gained passages demanding obedience. When a priestly class needed power, the laws became stricter. The text did not simply survive history, it was sculpted by it. Look closely, and the fingerprints are everywhere. They are in the sudden shifts of tone. They are in the passages that interrupt earlier ideas. They are in the contradictions that appear between two chapters that should agree but do not. These are not the marks of divine revelation. They are the marks of human revision, and the most significant edits were made for one purpose above all others. The people in power understood that a unified story creates a unified people. Unity, in their eyes, was worth rewriting anything. A unified story creates a unified people. A tribe that worships many gods has room for disagreement. Each family can cling to its own tradition. Each village can defend its own rituals. Arguments break out because no single story sits above all the others. But the moment a tribe accepts one god as the only authority, everything changes. A tribe with one god is not encouraged to debate, it is commanded to obey. Monotheism did not rise because it offered deeper truth. It rose because it offered stronger control. Leaders quickly realized that a single divine figure creates a single narrative. And a single narrative creates social discipline. If everyone believes they answer to the same cosmic judge, disagreement becomes dangerous, rebellion becomes a sin, even doubt becomes a crime of the mind. It is no surprise that monotheism grew alongside expanding power structures. The message was simple. If we all follow the same God, we cannot fight each other. And if we all follow the same God, we can fight everyone else together. A shared deity becomes a shared identity. That identity becomes loyalty, and loyalty becomes political power. Once leaders saw the effect, they embraced it fully. Monotheism became the glue that held fragile tribes together. Later, it became the stabilizing force for entire kingdoms, and eventually it became the spiritual backbone of empires. It did not spread because it was the only truth in a world full of myths. It spread because it was the most effective tool for unity. A unified story could silence dissent. A unified story could mobilize armies. A unified story could justify expansion. And that kind of power does not stay spiritual for long. It becomes something else. Something bigger. Something political. And that need for unity pushed the sacred text into its next evolution, one that would reshape society itself. Turn a story into law, and you own the future. Stories can move the heart, but they do not control behavior. A story might inspire someone for a moment, but it cannot force them to act a certain way. That is why the biblical text slowly shifts from myth and narrative into strict instruction. At some point, the storytellers realized that inspiration was not enough. If they wanted predictable citizens and obedient followers, they needed rules that sounded untouchable. So the text begins to speak in commands. Do this, do not do that, believe this, never question that. These are not poetic reflections or gentle suggestions. They are behavioral systems designed to govern every part of life. Marriage becomes regulated. Property becomes regulated. Economic relationships, sexual boundaries, inheritance rights, family hierarchy, even clothing and diet are pulled under the control of the sacred text. Religion transforms into something larger than belief. It becomes the first operating system for society, not divine software drifting down from the heavens, but human engineering wrapped in the authority of the sacred. When a rule is presented as a divine instruction, the people following it no longer ask who benefits from it. They no longer question who wrote it or why. They simply obey. And here is the dark truth behind this transformation. People obey systems far more easily than they obey stories. A story can be interpreted, a story can be adapted, a story can be ignored. But a system built on laws creates habits, creates fear, creates patterns that pass from one generation to the next. It shapes the future long after the original authors are gone. By turning stories into commandments, the people in power found a way to guide behavior without ever lifting a sword. But even that was not the final purpose behind the Bible. There was something larger at stake. The real purpose: to justify authority forever. Every empire in history has searched for the same thing. Not soldiers, not gold, not territory. Empires crave legitimacy. Without it, a ruler is just another ambitious man with a weapon. Without it, an army is simply a group of paid fighters. But with legitimacy, even the most questionable decisions can be defended. And nothing grants legitimacy more effectively than a holy book. Kings rise and fall. Armies win and lose. Power built only on worldly force is fragile. It must be constantly defended and constantly feared. But a sacred text creates a different kind of power. A king can be challenged. A priest can be rejected. But a divine order, written in a holy book, cannot be questioned without feeling like you are questioning existence itself. If the king is wrong, the people might rebel. If the priest is wrong, the people might walk away. But if the God behind the book is wrong, what foundation is left to stand on? Most people cannot even imagine holding that thought in their minds. This is the true power of the Bible. Not the miracles it describes, not the prophecies it promises, not the visions or the poetry or the moral lessons. The real power comes from the silence it creates, the silence that smothers doubt, the silence that turns questions into sins, the silence that stops people from challenging authority because that authority claims to speak for the divine. Once people accept that a ruler stands on sacred ground, their obedience is no longer forced. It becomes internal. It becomes voluntary. They follow not because they fear punishment from a king, but because they fear punishment from the universe. And when a society reaches that point, the people who hold the text in their hands can do more than control the present. They can guide the destiny of entire civilizations. They can steer history itself. So, why was the Bible written? When you connect every thread we have explored, the larger pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Bible was not born from a single moment of divine revelation. It grew out of the human need to make sense of a chaotic world. At first, it offered simple explanations for storms, sickness, death, and suffering. It helped frightened people feel a little safer. That was its first purpose. But once fear became manageable, the text shifted. It began to guide behavior. It created boundaries. It provided rituals that gave structure to societies that were still fragile and unstable. Soon the stories were not just about fear. They were about belonging. They were about unity. And unity is a powerful resource. As tribes grew into larger groups, the text evolved again. It became the justification for leadership. Rulers could point to sacred passages and claim that their authority came from a higher plane. Priests could point to commandments and claim that their decisions were not personal, but cosmic. The book became a tool for maintaining order and for building hierarchies that would last. Then came the age of kingdoms and empires. The text was no longer merely a guide for small communities. It became the backbone of entire civilizations. Laws were shaped through it. Armies marched under its symbols. Economies were structured according to its rules. The sacred narrative was now a political engine that stabilized power and kept populations aligned. At every stage, the Bible adapted to the needs of the people who controlled it. It grew into the perfect system, not because it revealed the mind of a god, but because it created a structure that people believed came from a god. That belief was powerful enough to survive threats, wars, and centuries of change. So the Bible was not written to reveal divinity. It was written to create a strategy that could endure forever. So here's the truth most people never hear. The Bible didn't shape humanity because it was inspired. It shaped humanity because it was useful. Useful to control fear, useful to unify tribes, useful to justify authority, useful to build empires. And once you understand the purpose behind the text, you can finally see through the illusion of divine authorship. You can see the people behind the curtain, the motives, the edits, the strategies, and you're left with a choice. Follow the stories that were designed to control you, or step into a life guided by your own reason. If this video made you question what you were taught, subscribe, not for belief, but for clarity, for courage, for truth. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and never give your mind to a book that was written to own it.